Issues about health and fitness will be covered in Module 10 with special attention to the youngest populations, children, specifically training children for either cardiovascular endurance, strength, flexibility. Any exercise science student should be familiar with the fitness components that are typically tested. In this particular module, children are, in a sense, a special population, and what rules may apply to adults with respect to training for the following fitness components may not necessarily apply to young developing organisms. And finally, at the bottom, there is a section on the chapter in the text that have to deal with obesity. We will cover this as well. Let's begin with measures of cardiovascular fitness. Endurance is the ability to sustain work. Therefore, it is predicated on a healthy heart and musculature that is able to contract at long periods of time. So cardiac output is a good place to start. We'll talk about heart rate and stroke volume. And as far as the gold standard in measuring the ability to sustain work, that should be the max VO2 or VO₂max. For the heart rate, we are going to cover all ages in the lifespan and their corresponding average heart rates. We begin with the fetus. Fetal heart rate is very fast, hovering around 135 to 140 beats per minute. The newborn, a little bit slower, but is still very fast, about 130 beats per minute. For children, it's quite normal. Obviously, children, that's a long age range, but in terms of the kids that typically will be getting some cardiovascular training, that's from anywhere from 6 years old to about 11, 12, 9 to 100 beats per minute. The adolescent, it's more like an aberration here because they record, at least the one that is cited in the text, from 60 to 65 beats per minute, whereas the adult, what most of us know on average, is about 70 beats per minute. A measure of how efficient the heart is in pumping blood is the stroke volume. It's the amount of blood that is pumped out of the heart per beat. Taken together, the cardiac output is a multiplication of the stroke volume per cardiac heart rate. So in the larger scheme of things, highly trained athletes whom you will estimate to have lower than average, in other words, their hearts are probably beating within the 55 to 65 beats per minute. Their heart is so efficient and probably adapted so that it is hypertrophied and therefore can pump a lot more blood. Therefore, their stroke volume will be higher. Despite having a slower heart rate, the overall effect is that they are not as taxed and not as pressed, more or less maintaining a healthy heart throughout their lifespan. The assumption is they've kept healthy throughout. Okay, as far as a measure of the ability to sustain work, VO₂max is that index. Now, most of us, it's easy for you to make sense of what VO₂max is, but make no assumptions. It appears that a lot of exercise science students do not understand what the max there means. VO2, that's the volume of oxygen at max, meaning max effort. How do you measure this? There's several protocols that does this. For those of you who have taken your exercise physiology classes or exercise testing and prescription, you will have covered this. This is not the domain of this module nor this course. Suffice it to say, because a maximum effort is required, typically this is done in a laboratory where you, please take note, data for collecting this is highly unreliable for children. Most of the time, the tester will be screaming at the performer and in his face to give his maximum best. They could be quite animated in doing this, but think in terms of how this would be done with children. Younger children, it's either they take you too seriously and they cry because they think you are being very mean to them, or if they have a sense of humor, they think you're not being serious at all and likely laugh at you. The end result is, bottom line, at least in your text, even it's acknowledged that any data before the teenage years has to be taken with a lot of grain of salt. What are the issues when it comes to this? Assuming that the numbers we have gotten is correct, assuming there are no measurement errors. As far as data is concerned, between genders, males and females, at about 12 years, there are no significant differences in VO₂max. And this is where the precipitous decline in activity and exercise among women begin to take its toll. For a lot of girls, VO₂max begins its steep slide after the age of 12. Whereas the boys continue on with activity and sport, the girls have stopped and begin to reap the negative results after. As for training children, can endurance training benefit prepubescent children? We cannot test them, it's very hard to test them, but is there a way to make them improve cardiovascularly? Whereas the book may be unclear, other findings from recent studies suggest that it is correct. Prepubescent children do benefit from cardiovascular training. However, what's important is looking at the source of this improvement. When you think about short-term training effects, most of the time the kids improve their run times, the kids improve their endurance because they've gotten better at the mechanics of the skill. Say, for example, running, usual way to test for cardiovascular endurance. With a lot of practice, with continued refining of skills, kids are likely to exhibit better mechanics. There is no actual physical adaptation, or there's minimal physical adaptation to account for the improvement. In other words, if you are training a prepubescent child, the child that you had prior to training and the child that you had after training, physically, little has changed. In other words, the heart did not become bigger, the lungs did not become more efficient in harnessing oxygen. What changed is the skill, better mechanics. What changed is their level of skillfulness. Switching over to training children long term. Here lies the difference. One has to account for the natural process that the child is undergoing. In a long-term window, in a period where growth and maturation are expected to cross several ages and stages, from childhood to late childhood to adolescence and probably approaching adulthood, one has to account for the adaptation that can occur when they're training for cardiovascular efficiency. Nonetheless, in terms of the overall effect, better mechanics are maintained. The assumption is the training is about providing them skills. But along the way, the heart will adapt. You expect there to be some level of hypertrophy. There is some improvement in how blood and hemoglobin are able to harness oxygen. You expect changes in lung capacity. Thus, when you think in terms of the child you were training at 7 years old, the before training child, and the after training child, you are talking about a different person physically altogether. Finishing up on the aerobic trainability issue, comparing prepubescent to postpubescent children. Something must be said about the development of kids after their hormones have kicked in, after they've already achieved their maximum height, um, and they are basically layering on a lot more muscle and a lot of bone. What Roland has shown is that children, though they may not have certain adaptations, still get something out of a training. But in terms of getting more bang for your buck as far as training cardiovascularly, what young adults or those children who are approaching adulthood are capable of improving in terms of adaptation, there really is a justification for simply working on the skills in the earlier phases. And as far as training for cardiovascular endurance, much of the improvement will happen later, much later after adolescence and towards adulthood. Let's look at strength this time. Um, from the get-go, I would like to contrast differences between males and females, and we are already straddling from prepubescent to postpubescent here because the point of comparison is between 7 to 17 years. This is already taking on a point of view of long-term effects. As a footnote, when a lot of the tests for strength endurance were conjured up, things have changed now. Presently, you have your fitness gram, but a long time ago, in terms of data, field tests for strength endurance comprised of different tests for boys and girls. For boys, they are doing a lot of the pull-ups. For girls, they're doing the modified sit-up, where the anchor is at the knee. One can argue that really this is not a fair comparison, and you will be right. However, for the sake of actually looking at the pre and post, we're not comparing across genders, but in terms of what happens between prepubescent to postpubescent, it will show that the strength increase for boys is almost a 400% increase, whereas for girls, while you might think that is a lot at 260%, what becomes more relevant is the source of that increase in strength. With the boys, at 17, when they have increased considerably in weight and their body functions, this is growth, and they've also increased with respect to maturation. The body itself is able to handle protein synthesis much better, ergo, the ability to build muscle. In terms of pattern of activity, boys continue to be involved in sport. In other words, there are training effects. It's heavily weighted on the male side, clearly. A lot of that increase in strength is attributable to the weight increase that came along with it. Simply by gaining mass, does that make you gain strength? It would be a good idea to clarify Newton's second law here. Mass by itself provides an avenue for the potential ability to generate force. Newton's second law is F equals ma. Your ability to generate force is dependent on the mass of the person and the acceleration. Of course, there's that interaction between mass and acceleration, but that's for another discussion. For now, suffice it to say, for now, weight or mass is something to reckon with. Can strength training benefit children? The question here obviously is going to focus on prepubescent children. Yes, it appears to have some influence on strength. I believe the data here is based on 6-year-old children. For those of you who've worked with kids in summer camps, many a time you see an increase in their strength. As previously indicated, you cannot ignore Newton here. F equals mass times acceleration. You have to consider that growth is a factor. Maturation is ability to function well. In that sense, from a purely mechanical equation, the acceleration increase means that they're able to move faster. Where lies the source of that quickness? Your book is very explicit in identifying neural adaptation as a part of the process, but there's also hypertrophy to be hypertrophy to think about. So, with regards to neural adaptation, this this is wonderfully done in Figure 7-7 of the text. What here I am doing is to guide you through that figure instead of just pasting it. As I will go through the curves for strength so that you can see the perspective that they take on. On the x-axis, remember, we are talking about the increase in strength between childhood to adulthood, from 7 to 17 years old. In other words, at some point you have to cross the line from being a child and going beyond the adolescent growth spurt. On the x-axis is training time. On the y-axis, for whatever, this is a hypothetical curve, strength measured in Newton meters. Okay? So this period of time, which is prior to the adolescent growth spurt, how much of that early training phase influences your ability to gain strength? Looking at the steepness of that curve, quite a lot. A lot of strength could be gained in that early phases. How much of it is accounted for by neural? Okay? Neural, as it implies, it has to do with the brain. When it says neural adaptation, that's another way of saying neural coordination or neuromuscular adaptation. In other words, you got more skillful. So in that early phase of training, prior to the adolescent growth spurt, what accounts for the increase in strength or the increase in the ability to generate force is largely neural. The growth part, in other words, the part when your androgens have kicked in, when your muscles are layering, in other words, there's the growth and hypertrophy figuring in everything else above neural. When does that kick in? Okay, when serious training has kicked in, post-adolescent growth spurt, you can see that all of this, everything above from here on out, because neural, the assumption it plateaus at some point. You've become skillful, now you work on the actual power. All of that after the growth spurt can be accounted for by hypertrophy and growth. But not to say it doesn't contribute in the early parts, because there should be some of that. However, at some point, and most of you who are training know the experience of reaching a plateau. At some point, the limits of the body is reached. It's much harder to get those large incremental increases in strength. It is potentially possible to artificially increase that, but most likely it is illegal. So that's where steroid comes in. And this is essentially figure 7-7 of the text. Question is, does strength gained as a child remain through adulthood? Unfortunately, no. And the correlation between strength as a child versus strength as an adult has clear empirical data to show that you basically have to keep working at your strength. This is a good time as any to introduce that concept called use it or lose it. Okay? There's no way to store strength. The only way to maintain strength is to keep working at it. Question is, can strength training prevent age-related declines in strength? Is there a magic formula? Because whether we like it or not, time goes on and we are going to age. Well, it cannot prevent declines in strength. Biology has a way of degenerating as age creeps in. Nevertheless, exercise has the power to retard that decline. The rate of decline can be slowed down. And on top of that, if people start out at such a high level, that steepness of the curve for decline may not be as steep as one who has not been exercising. In addition, The good news for the rest of us, doesn't matter what age, it is never too late to begin resistance training. What data has shown is that even institutionalized frail elderly increase their strength scores and functionality after a regimen of strength training. 60-year-old active females have shown the ability to be just as powerful and strong as your 20 to 30-year-old females. I have one name to give you, Martina Navratilova. Those of you who play tennis. Martina Navratilova won her last US Open title at the age of 50. She is a paragon of being able to maintain her skills. Obviously, she still has skills and strength at 50. She won the US Open. I forget what year it is. Now, as far as the third component of fitness, flexibility. By definition, flexibility is the ability to move the joints through a full range of motion. Because it works on the opposite side, that is of prevention of injury. You would hope that people who have full range of motion have been nicely battling awkward landings and awkward this and that. In other words, preventing injury for all the things that they are subjecting themselves to. But you see that it's hard to quantify this because that's the whole point. You prevent injury from happening. And there's no way to test that in any really very clear empirical way. What has been supported in the literature is an individual's flexibility decreases without training, even during childhood and adolescence. It's one of those things where if you don't do your flexibility exercises, you may not think that it is not affecting you negatively. However, it has been shown that even young children, what we perennially think, or at least old wives' tale, that we think that all children are flexible. It may not be true after all. So when in effect, as the principle use it or lose it applies to strength, so does it apply to flexibility. The declines have been well documented, and what's appalling is that decline has started in childhood. Flexibility is quite variable in adolescence as patterns of activity participation change. But what's disturbing is that declines have begun in childhood. It turns out too, participation in exercise is a better predictor of flexibility than gender. Again, old wives' tales that we tend to cling on to. Most people think that simply by being female, that means that they are preternaturally blessed by good flexibility. Not true. There's so many men who are flexible, both as a product of DNA and genetics and as a product of training. Here's the good news. Flexibility training can bring about an improvement in joint range of motion at any age. Again, the same principle. Now, we transition to the latter part of that chapter having to do with obesity. The title here is Obesity and Lifespan Considerations. We talk about this. One would think that this is logically a part of the growth module, since obesity is having to do with being too big for your height. We begin by first defining obesity. Here is where it is important to make the distinction with children. With adults, typically the number that's thrown around is BMI. Okay? At the bottom where it says body mass index. You've encountered this term when we were talking about growth. But when it comes to children, you are not to be married to only one of these indices. You have to consider it in light of body composition and percentile ranking in a growth chart. Growth charts only apply to children, by the way, so it is important that they have to be taken note of. So, for body composition, anybody with greater than 40% body fat is considered obese. In terms of percentile ranking, the likelihood is people who are 85th percentile or above are likely obese. Some people will say 95th percentile. And then here in body mass index, if you look at the charts, and you can just look this up on your own, BMI greater than 30 kilograms per meter squared, typically you have crossed over to the obese side. Now what about children? What's alarming here is the increasing trend since the 60s and still ongoing to the 21st century. Prior to the 60s, or at least even right about the 60s, the overweight and obese rate at that point is 5%. Recent data of overweight or obese children has increased in 2000 to 15%, greater than 15%, 2004 greater than 18%, and that rate is probably still climbing. It's been a long battle, but we seem to always be on the losing end as far as losing weight. There have been more initiative right now from the government to help the kids along. Not a lot of recent data that assesses the effectivity of those programs yet. But if you are going to look at the data, it can be very sobering. 50% of overweight kids will end up to become overweight adults. It gets even more stark how you almost sentence them to a life of being obese. 70% of overweight adolescents go on to become overweight adults. Let's look at the main reasons for obesity. I mean, if we're going to solve this problem, we have to look at the root causes of this. 90% of cases of obesity pretty much is the age-old diet and exercise conundrum. Eating too much of the wrong food. That's the nutrition side of it. As exercise scientists, our part in here is about the activity, and we'll address that in a short while. 10% of individuals who become obese arrive at a condition secondary to medical disorders. In other words, it is lifestyle oriented. If 90% of our being overweight and obese is attributable to something that we can change, therefore it is preventable. Nevertheless, even if it's only 10%, you have to deal with the genetic side of it. Look at this. If one parent is obese, there's a huge 40% chance that the child can become obese. And this is where it becomes alarming. Even if there's no parent that is obese, there is still a 15% chance of obesity. The fact that there are no obese parents, still a chunk of probabilities or a chunk of chance that a child becomes obese, and that will have something to do with his lifestyle. A couple more sobering statistics. If a child, whatever age in that childhood period, is at 95th percentile, he or she has a 60% chance to become obese by 35 years. There is a caveat in all of this. As much as we're proponents of the idea that this is a lifestyle thing, in other words, obesity being a preventable and a something that we can get a handle on. The fact is, fitness as a child does not automatically translate to fitness in adulthood. There are more complications of obesity. This part of what we call the metabolic syndrome, this is nothing new to you, and it's nothing surprising. You expect more heart disease and hypertension to be associated with obesity, along with apnea, which is a case where people have difficulty breathing. Some of it, obviously a mechanical problem, has to do with the flow of air in and out. And what's further alarming is the association of obesity with diabetes. Diabetes rates basically parallel that of obesity. Prior to 1990, type 2 diabetes was quite uncommon in individuals below 40 years old. That is why it was a misnomer. People tend to say that type 2 diabetes is adult onset. However, given the recent data, 4-year-olds have been recently diagnosed with diabetes. That's type 2. My assumption is you understand the difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Suffice it to say that type 1 diabetes, again, misnomer, most people think of this as juvenile diabetes. Type 1 diabetes, officially, it has to do with being insulin dependent. In other words, it's the lack of insulin that's causing the diabetes. Therefore, the drug is insulin. The manner of treatment or management is insulin. Type 2 is a bit more complicated because it is lifestyle related. Thus, it doesn't matter what age. If you have a 4-year-old who is not eating properly, there is a probability of him or her being obese. Type 2 diabetes is insulin resistant. In other words, is the thermostat, the metabolic climate, and basically sugar regulation in the body is out of whack. So type 2 is a more complicated version of diabetes. Here are a couple of pictures of kids that for their age is quite alarming. For this picture on your right, the camera view is from the top. I hope you figure that out. The fact that these kids have gained so much weight at a very early age does not bode well for them as adults. As we go through the statistics, where do we stand as a country? Where does the United States rank in terms of overweight and obesity? This is a 2004 slide. There are more recent data there, but pretty much the story has remained the same. Yay, we're number one. The United States is number one in the incidence of obesity and overweight. The best statistics are coming from Asia. The recent data, basically Korea and Japan flip and flop as to who is number one in being at least on the healthy zone. What I want you to look at here is that despite the United States being obviously a highly industrialized nation, there's a bunch of highly industrialized nations in here that are doing very well. Norway, Denmark, France, and Switzerland. What is it about these countries, particularly about France and Switzerland, where you don't typically associate their diets, their nutrition, to be, you know, to have lesser fat? Our idea of a French dessert, for example, has to have a lot of butter. But this is where it's really a combination of activity and diet. For a lot of these people, the conjured up notion of them being very lavish in their cuisine, those are for special occasions. The ordinary French, the ordinary Swiss, they cook very probably heavy meals at the middle of the day, but by the evening they are, you know, it's the portion control, it's the portion sizes. They're not as large as what we find here in the United States. I'm pretty sure they have buffets there too, but how can you argue with the number of people going to Golden Corral on a daily basis and, consuming all that food? In addition, in France and Switzerland, and I presume also in Denmark and Norway, they do a lot of walking. Pretty much their lifestyle includes activity embedded in it. Okay. Couple more sobering statistics, albeit this was in 2013, of the large cities in the United States. I've highlighted the 5 cities that are here in Texas. Corpus Christi is number 1. It used to be Houston, and Houston got a lot of flack for being labeled as the fattest city in the United States. But the fact is, big cities in Texas are competing for that crown, being the fattest large city in the United States. And if you look at smaller cities, obviously you cannot compare large and small cities. Although West Virginia is represented here twice by 2 small cities, number 3 and number 6. Texas, I've highlighted here, is number 1, McAllen, and another city, Beaumont, Port Arthur. Not very, a little bit perturbing for somebody who lives in Texas. So, when we think of obesity having to deal with too little activity, what is the relationship of TV watching and inactivity? Is the digital medium the culprit. Do we watch too much TV? Do we watch too much YouTube? Do we sit around too long in front of our computers? As it turns out, TV watching, at least in the study, it only covered TV watching. TV watching and inactivity are two very independent factors. Okay? Let's take the case of so many athletes that I know. They're very active. But guess what? How many of them also watch a lot of TV? So it is very difficult to make that connection because from studies that have gone on, it appears that TV is more highly associated not so much with inactivity, but with food intake. Sit through 1 hour of TV watching and observe all the ads that they target children. How much of it is about enticing them for that yummy whatever it is? That's probably high fat and it's probably going to be very bad for your heart. Okay, and if you look at other factors that probably is a phenomenon only in large cities, is the urban disconnect. How accessible are facilities? Are we prioritizing elite performers versus the average kids? Look at the facilities of Texas Tech. Those that are really for show, for the competition, only the elite athletes can use. The track and field. There are other states that are doing a better job of it. University of Oregon is known as Tracktown USA. That's where a lot of U.S. Olympic trials have been held. They have 2 full-size tracks. They open that up anytime, actually, unless there's competition going around. But it's open to anybody and everybody. So possibly a reason why more people are not exercising, I'm not really sure. But it's something to consider. Are there enough programs for kids to walk to school? Given that nowadays in an urban setting, everybody drives. In Texas, everybody loves their cars too much. Do we do a lot of stair climbing? Well, not in Lubbock. How many buildings in a Texas Tech campus will you be able to get a good workout going up and down stairs? Stair climbing is a big deal in New York. A lot of people use this as their daily exercise. As they go to work, they don't take the elevators, they take the stairs. So they build in the activity into their daily lifestyle. Now, as far as monitoring food contracts in schools, that's a whole can of worms in itself. But when you have, I'll give you this as an example. Not so much that there's a food contract. In the building of the Health, Exercise, and Sports Sciences here at the Tech's campus, there's no source of any type of food except a vending machine. And what do you get from vending machine? It's a good thing that we're not contracted with that. But how many schools are under contract to sell Coke and Coke products? Finally, how does motor development figure in the conversation of obesity? We alluded to this when we discussed training effects for cardiovascular endurance and strength endurance. Think about it. Those kids improved their run times. Those kids improved their strength simply because they got better. They became more skillful, thus they were able to wield more power, more strength, thus they were able to run longer and streamline their motion so that it is efficient. What data do we have? Okay, so motor development and obesity, if I were to pontificate at this point, if I were to say the gospel of motor development, it is here. Skillfulness is needed to persist in activity. Recall one of the biggest concepts we started right day one. Persistence and activity is mediated by achievement in the sport. In other words, the more skillful you are, the more likely it is that you will stay in the sport. The marginal player or the player who sucks at basketball will stop torturing himself and probably quit. As we recall the source of improvement in cardiovascular and strength components, do not forget these terms: neuromuscular coordination or neural adaptation. The word neural invokes the brain. The fact is, when we've become coordinated, you adapt your body so that it becomes skillful. And that's a huge part of generating force and strength, and should guide us for the rest of our, at least in our own lifestyles.